So a few years ago, there was this little boom of indie horror games that had pixel aesthetics. And there were several games that got really popular around this time period, but the one that stands out the most in my mind and was one of the first to really start the trend was Ib. Ib didn't invent the pixel RPG Maker horror genre, but it was one of the first I remember making the rounds back around 2012. I remember almost every nascent Let's Player playing it, and I think that was part of the charm of the genre too. They made good YouTube material because they had a set beginning, middle, and end. Most of these games were free to play, or at least very inexpensive too. Also, they were usually relatively short. You could knock out 1 or 2 games in an afternoon. That being said, if it's been a while for you like it has been for me, I recommend you go back and play the game yourself again, or watch someone else play it. And if you've never played it before, play it! It's free and it only takes a couple of hours to beat. I'll leave a link down in the description. I just wanted to put a warning out there because I'll probably spoil a lot of the plot of the game in this video. So if you've never played it before, go play it and then come back. Anyways, if you don't want to play it again or just need a refresher, the story follows a little girl named Ib who gets lost in a haunted art gallery. Throughout the game, you solve puzzles, try not to get murdered by paintings, and interact with multiple colorful characters. Looking back on other games that rose to popularity around the same time, I think what sets Ib apart is its aesthetic. Ib looks vastly different from games like The Witch's House or Mad Father, which are probably its closest contemporaries. Ib's art was created by the game's developer Garry. Their art style has a sort of off-putting feel to it. I know some people dislike it, and that's fine, it's very imperfect and messy. But that art style works well in a horror game. Part of why I had a difficult time getting into especially Mad Father was how clean and almost cutesy the art was. It's hard to be spooked by pretty anime characters, is all I'm saying. Not that it can't be done, but... Another thing that makes Ib so special is its concept. There's so much you can do with the idea of an art gallery, and I think Garry really used the limited medium of RPG Maker to its fullest. All of the paintings and sculptures feel so unique, and it's clear that they put a lot of time into figuring out how each piece plays into the storyline, even if the art itself has no bearing on the story. The characters that do affect the story, though, have such unique looks. The way the portrait ladies and the headless mannequins move is genuinely unsettling, and don't get me started on the dolls. At this point, I kind of want to switch gears and talk about horror for a second. I would consider myself to be a casual horror fan. I'm more into true crime than something like Paranormal Activity, but I do feel like a lot of my favorite things incorporate horror elements or are straight up horror. Like one of my favorite movies is the Stanley Kubrick version of The Shining, and I pretty much exclusively for a really long time only played horror games when I was about 14 or 15. My favorite type of horror though is psychological horror. I much prefer a story that scares you through mental manipulation than gore or jump scares, and Ib is the definition of psychological horror. There's not really any blood or violence, and very little in the way of jump scares. Ib makes you uneasy through a beautiful mix of dark hints and sound design. Firstly, the sound design is incredible. Everything about the sound effects, when the music cuts in and out, and the music itself is deeply creepy. The music also lends itself to the story. The different songs used for each character basically explain the characters before you even spend all that much time interacting with them. Garry's calming guitar melody reveals his safe and compassionate nature, whereas Mary's creepy music box theme foreshadows how she turns out to be a painting, but also betrays her childish nature and how she really only wanted a friend after what could have been decades or even centuries of loneliness trapped in a haunted art gallery. Also, the only chase music that makes me tense up more than this game is the god-awful screeching sound they play whenever the monsters spot you in Amnesia: The Dark Descent. I've seen people complain that Ib's characters are kind of simple. They aren't that interesting or layered. I personally disagree. I feel like a lot of Ib's horror comes from the unknown, or what is only delivered to you in little hints. For the majority of the game, Ib can't even read all of the signs. The only time you can read everything is when Garry's around. There are lots of dialogue bits that, if you choose certain actions or take your time with character interactions, reveal a lot of the background of what's happening. There are several implications that something very, very dark is haunting the gallery, causing it to behave the way it does, but nothing explicit is ever said. I feel like the same logic can be applied to the characters. On a surface level reading, the only interesting thing about them is their character design. However, as you dig more into the bits and pieces you learn about their backstories, you can begin to piece together an underlying narrative about Garry and Mary's histories, as well as the history of all the paintings in the art gallery. Subtlety is one of Eve's strong points. As previously mentioned, the characters don't have their motivations and experiences presented outright. A lot is told through subtext, but subtlety also plays a big role in the gameplay as well. Eve is one of those games that rewards players who like to interact with every object or go through all of the dialogue options. This is in no small part due to the fact that what and who you interact with in the game affects what ending you get. Also, this game has like 10 different endings, and there are different variations of some of those endings too. On top of that, about a year after the game's original release, new endings and an entire bonus dungeon section were added, with the bonus dungeons only being accessible to people who played through the game twice. In fact, the little changes in Eve are what make multiple playthroughs so worthwhile. It's no Undertale where the game calls back on your old save files, but for every happy moment of the good endings, the bad endings just get more and more terrifying. There are also lots of things I noticed playing this game after a few years that I didn't originally. For example, when Eve, Garry, and Mary get split up, as you play as Eve, the only dangers are environmental. No paintings try to attack you, and the only way you can get hurt is if you do something to inflict pain on yourself. That's because you're with Mary, who the other creations in the art gallery don't view as an intruder. She's one of them. And there are lots of other little secrets that show up or change throughout each of the ending paths, but I won't spoil all of those in this video. There have been games that have come along since Eve that mess with your head more, that require a lot more digging to uncover the true underlying story, and are more unconventional in their use of horror. But Eve revels in its creative premise and scaring the player with the unknown. You don't know what in the art gallery is or isn't friendly. You don't know what a painting will do if you interact with it without the right item in your inventory or without solving a puzzle first. Eve doesn't need its characters to start killing themselves in order to freak you out. It does that just fine using what's mostly unseen or what's only seen in short glances. I don't know if it's because I played Eve for the first time at such a young age or what, but art galleries have always had a really eerie quality to me. The game itself puts it best. An artist puts a piece of their soul into their artwork. Art has a deep emotional element to it. It makes sense that those emotions would hold on. It gives art a life of its own, sometimes literally. Also, I shade Doki Doki Literature Club a couple of times in this video, but I don't hate Doki Doki Literature Club. I think it's a pretty good game. I just don't think it's as spooky and unpredictable as the people who made it thought it was, because I called Monica being an antagonist from the time you write the first poem, because you can't write one for her. I just assumed that she was gonna like go crazy and kill the main character or try to kill the player, because it's like a commentary on like the male gaze and how dating sims are like the fall of humanity or something, but oh well. I kind of prefer what they did with it anyways.